The session today is on maximising volunteer impact. My role currently is project programme director of the Litigant in-person support strategy, and that's a partnership of organisations who are trying to support people who are going through the legal system on their own. So it's a partnership of organisations. We help individuals in a variety of ways. What I'm particularly pleased to be here today is that I started off my career in the pro bono sector working on the LawWorks clinics project. So fantastic to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel today, and hopefully from all of you in the question and answer bit at the end of this. But for now, I'm going to hand over to the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. So starting with Jane, then Rebecca, Tracey and Deborah.
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm feeling the love, as my amazing volunteer manager always says, and it feels appropriate having come from Andrea Coomber's amazing presentations. So, I'm Chief Exec at Norfolk Community Law Service. I only started last October, and I thought I had loads of time to plan and think about, you know, understanding the service. And then a few months in, lockdown happened, so I'm still sort of finding my feet, I'd like to think, but it's been a chaotic time to be a chief exec, a relatively new chief exec, but I'm blessed that we are very established and have really good structures in place and an amazing team. We run a slightly different model, I think, to some of the others that I've heard from this morning. So we work very closely with the local university. We have so we run the law clinics, and we recruit 50 volunteers a year. And then we have free legal advice service, and we have a team of over 65 local solicitors who do that pro bono. And then we have a team of community volunteers. So that's our sort of volunteer model. And we do work in welfare benefits, immigration, debt, family, domestic abuse, employment law, and yeah, and then just general. So, and obviously we're based in Norfolk. We were based in Norwich, now we're all over the place, but we cover the county of Norfolk. So we have significant issues around the mix between urban, but very large swathes of very rural areas. So thanks very much. That's me.
Hi everybody, I'm Rebecca Greenhalgh. I am a senior associate and member of the pro bono team at Ashurst, one of the larger law firms. We have around 1,500, 1,600 lawyers across the world. I tick all the boxes. I started my career in the non-profit sector. I became a non-practicing barrister initially, and then I became a solicitor. And I now have 13 years in pro bono management. So I've seen from all the different perspectives. I also am one of the people who helps to try and do all the behind the scenes admin for the collaborative plan for pro bono for firms that are involved in that. And I also am the current co-president of the Association of Pro Bono Counsel for people who do this on a day-to-day basis around the world. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Tracey Horton. I'm the clinic manager at Staffordshire University. I was in private practice for best part 25 years and joined Staffordshire in around 2018 to set up the clinic. So we effectively have been running for 2 years. Our model is slightly different to other universities in that I take the clinic out to the clients. So we have clinics that go to the courts. We go to 2 local hospitals, a local prison, a military base, and various community hubs on council estates. It is in theory term time only, but I have kept the clinic running remotely since lockdown, but that effectively is me and a couple of students. So it's a slightly different service than the service that runs in term time. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Deborah Smith. I am an executive director and senior counsel to the investment banking division at Goldman Sachs. I also am the co-chair of the Goldman Sachs EMEA Pro Bono Committee. And I also am a founder and steering committee member of the in-house Pro Bono group, which is, I think, the parallel group to Rebecca's collaborative plan. We are a group of in-house lawyers who are active in the pro bono space.
Great, thanks, Deborah. I almost feel like we should finish this session then. It seemed to work quite well so far, so I think we should kind of quit while we're ahead. But as you can see, I think it's great. We've got a real variety on the panel, and having had a quick look at the participants, I think we should get some kind of badge. There's now over 100. But it's great, there's a real variety of participants too. So like I said, if you've got questions, we've got 15 minutes at the end, so please do make the most of that opportunity there. We're going to start, first of all, a question to Jane, which is, and sorry, just to set the scene for you all a bit, because obviously this is around maximising volunteer impact. And we had a discussion earlier this week about to what extent should we be trying to talk about, or what were the issues we all faced kind of previously before COVID-19. And our sense was, in a way, it's inevitably going to come up. So some of what we're saying will probably refer to how services were traditionally operating, some about them maybe now, and some in the future. So hopefully, you know, inevitably covering a bit of all of that for you. But to start off, Jane, in your experience, what's been the most innovative way you've seen organisations use volunteers? And what ingredients do you think made it work well?
I think the ingredients were really easy when we were in the office because it was cake in terms of engaging people and getting them committed. That's a bit harder. Remote cake is a bit of a challenge for us. So we have to think about different ingredients. But there's a couple of things that I just wanted to flag up. So our office is closed before lockdown was announced, and we had clients booked in for we have a drop-in service on a Friday, for example, which is very established. And we're really worried that our office is closed on the Wednesday, and we knew we had this free legal advice drop-in on the Friday, that clients wouldn't find us. So we came up with the concept of a justice bus. We did some quick signs and laminated them while we were still in the office, preparing for everybody to work from home, and basically parked the bus outside our offices for 2 days. We'd planned to do it for longer, but then they announced full lockdown on the Monday. And yeah, we were able to help quite a lot of clients who just came to us, clients who'd been made the most vulnerable, clients that had travelled. One client that travelled from Great Yarmouth to Norwich, and check on the map, that's quite a long way for someone coming to us via public transport, and we were able to help them. So that was quite an innovation. Now we're able to go out a little bit more. We have taken the bus to a food bank so that we can engage with. We've been invited by some of the local food banks to be a little bit more proactive. So you know, that's one way to think very differently about how we deliver our services and use our volunteers. And another way, obviously, the engagement of volunteers. So we interviewed 39 students from the university, the local law school, UEA, by video, and one of those was in Malaysia. Not sure that we would have been able to interview them if it wasn't for this new remote world that we're in. So that's another innovation for us. And then we've managed to get phones into some of our community volunteers, and we've developed a remote hearing feedback form. And we felt that a lot of the response to remote hearings about how it was working was coming from the courts and from solicitors, and we were worried about client voice being lost. So we've developed a client feedback form for remote hearings, and our volunteers with phones that we provided them are ringing those clients and trying to capture how it was for them. We do a before to support them, and then an after, and hopefully we'll develop that and be able to inform what remote working looks like, because we embrace technology, of course we do, but we really feel that face-to-face, the love that Andrea was talking about, there's a lot to be said for keeping in touch, and that there's that physical face-to-face as well. So yeah, so hopefully that covers some of the things that we've done.
Thanks for that, Jane. We're hoping, Deborah or Tracey in particular, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just add to that. I think that so we at Goldman, we were working together with Centrepoint and created a Connect Legal Advice clinic that was a virtual clinic, which we actually created and launched in April of 2016. And I think that's just an interesting example of kind of innovation outside the scope of a pandemic. And I think that, the pandemic's great because it really highlights the need for the innovation and really accelerates a lot of the innovation that we're seeing. But it's always interesting to see, examples outside of that, and how hopefully bringing the, technology to the forefront, hopefully we'll see that continue on, and that people will continue to think about different ways to reach people. And we set up that clinic really just in in response to a need of both the volunteers on our end who were finding it difficult to actually get to the clinic, but also on the side of the clinic where they were finding difficulty scheduling things, and just found that the advice provided, you know, on a kind of quick basis was easier addressed with technology. So, you know, another example of innovation, but outside the context of what we're going through today.
I'd just like to add that I think if you've got appropriate systems embedded into your clinic, I have a lot of systems, a lot of office manuals, a lot of processes. We have a case management system which I'm going to go into later. It's relatively easy to adapt then if something does happen. I mean, I could go remotely within 24 hours, and that's what we did. So I think if the systems are embedded at the start, it's and there have been parts of my clinics where I've taken it to venues where it hasn't worked. So I've been able to move it very quickly without a lot more impact and imposition on the students. It's very easy to be mobile. So I think just the systems are key to make sure that they're up and running at the start.
Thanks, Tracey. I think that's what's really helpful about this, is actually there's the opportunity, and like I said, hopefully afterwards, if people are particularly interested about some things that have been raised by the panellists, then there's the opportunity to follow up afterwards, because like I said, you're able to see what people have been trialling, not just kind of over the past few months, but obviously over the past few years. The second question, and I may be now getting ahead of myself, we slightly ambitiously, I was told by Claire Johnson when we were setting up this panel that we could try and do a poll. I then asked just before this session started, like, has anyone else used a poll? And they said no. But I think we might just have a go, because it's quite nice. I'm slightly aware with so many people on this call, but actually we can only hear from a few of you. It'd be really interesting just to try and get a bit of a sense of what you're all experiencing in your clinics at the moment. So before I put the question to the panel, one of the things we're wanting to ask you is, over the last 2 months, what changes have you seen in your volunteers? I'm afraid it has to be a multiple choice question, so it's very simple, and hopefully you'll get a box saying either we have more people volunteering, or we have, oh, there we go, less people volunteering. I'm so amazed this seems to be working. It's even asked myself about it. So if you could just feed that in, that'd be really interesting, just for us to start to get some feedback from these sessions as to what you're all experiencing. I don't actually run a clinic, so I can't even know how to fill it in myself, but we'll crack on anyway. So while you're completing that, the next question I was going to go to Rebecca, first of all, please, to lead with this, is what have you learned from trying to coordinate volunteering opportunities during a crisis? Because I know that refers to what's happening now, but you've been involved in something as well in the past.
Yeah. Thanks, Bex. So we've had a couple of events where people have suddenly all wanted to try and volunteer in a crisis. We had Grenfell, where suddenly lots of lawyers were saying, what can we do? How can we help? And then we've had COVID, where again, especially in the law firm setting, people were immediately saying, what can we do? How can we help? There must be something we can do. And, you know, one of the things we learned previously, and we've tried to really reinforce this time, is that it's great that people want to help, but that doesn't necessarily mean you personally are needed at this moment in time to deal with the needs that are emerging. You know, and it's from two perspectives, really. It's the not-for-profits themselves who we might be assisting. They're trying to deal with the crisis unfolding around them and making sure that their staff and that their clients are all still able to use the service and everybody's able to operate. So they're hugely busy anyway. And they're also dealing with that huge surge in legal demand that we've all been seeing around some very specialist areas of law. So it's almost the worst possible moment to say, actually, could you drop everything and train people who don't know what they're doing to be able to help? So, you know, I think that understanding that people will always want to help in a crisis, and actually the best thing we can do is make sure our potential volunteers understand the importance of volunteering way before then, to build skills and to build those relationships so that when these things happen, they are the most helpful resource they can be. And to just help manage people's expectations as well about, you may not all be needed in every single crisis, and where we need you, we will always draw on you, but be ready to step back. I think two other key tips would be the phone tree model, the ancient phone tree model, where one person rings a few people and they ring a few people and they ring a few people, and using that same approach for this, that, you know, if every single firm and every single organization contacts everybody, that's a huge amount of phone call and email going on when people are really busy. And so if instead you try and say, well, look, if you're doing this, if you're doing this, if you're doing this, and you're doing this, you have these conversations, feedback to everybody else, they can feed that back to people in their firm or their organization. And that's something we've seen with the collaborative plan firms. As everything started to happen with COVID, we had different firms being able to liaise with different organisations, find out what the issues were and come back and feed that into a more collective discussion about what was happening. And then we could go back to our firms and feed that back out. So that phone tree model, and I think I also describe it as the expanding circles. If you imagine that's the centre, you have more and more and more circles around it. The priority should always be that centre where the main work is happening right now in the response. It really doesn't have much space to take anything more. So those further out should be taking the task of having those conversations and removing the pressure as much as possible from those right at the centre. And then I think, sort of just finishing, and I suspect this will probably lead perfectly onto a comment Deborah had made previously, but it's just about doing what's needed, not what you want to do. That it's okay for all of us to just take a breath and understand what the legal needs are. There are so many varied areas of law that might arise in a crisis. There are lots of specialist organisations that advise on this. We need to understand when it's appropriate to give pro bono help and when actually that might in itself create other issues if organisations or sectors are trying to pitch for funding and secure additional funding. So let those organisations guide us as to what help they actually need and be ready to do that. And if you're not able to do that, that's fine. But if that's the case, be ready to step back and think, okay, how else can we deploy volunteers right now? Maybe that's about signposting them to other pro bono schemes that do need them. Or maybe it's about signposting them to community initiatives and other volunteering opportunities closer to home. And Deborah, I was going to hand over to you at this point because I thought you said a few things about that previously.
Yeah, Rebecca and I had been discussing this previously, and what we saw at Goldman was with the pandemic, we actually saw our lawyers turning towards their local communities. So the outreach to the pro bono committee actually dropped off at that time because everybody was focusing really on their neighborhood communities. And we actually, as a committee, found ourselves having to pivot to support them on projects that we didn't think we were going to have to support them on. I think we were looking kind of bigger picture, but we realized that people actually were looking at more grassroots organizations and had different types of questions, and we're really looking at GDPR concerns about the kind of neighborhood groups that had sprung up, etc. So we had to kind of be quick on our toes and pivot to address that, but a different reaction from what we had thought would happen. And I think now people are starting to move a bit beyond community and looking a bit at their immediate community and looking to the broader community. But it was an interesting development, one that we hadn't really anticipated on our end.
Can I jump in there? I have the exciting results from the poll, if anybody would be interested. And it might help to frame some more of the questions, although I'm not quite sure. I'm just going to share these results so that everyone can see. Quite an interesting split there, wouldn't you agree? Now that might be down to the fact that some of our audience and participants today aren't engaged in needing to engage volunteers. Some might be off making a cup of tea, but actually that's not what I was expecting at all either, so I'm not quite sure where we go from here, but just wanted to let you know.
It's interesting because I hesitated and I didn't know whether I should click more people volunteering or less people volunteering, because I saw more people doing their own type of volunteering and reaching out to their own local communities, and less people kind of coming to us as an organization, as the pro bono committee. So for me, I think I chose less because I was answering it more as the committee, but as an organization, I would have had to choose more. It was it's an interesting question, I think.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, we have more to come if we need to, but Bex, I mentioned we've got a couple of questions now, or do we want to leave them to the end?
If they relate to this session, very happy for you to bring them in now.
Yes. Well, I think it might be helpful to get them ticked off because there could be a lot of questions throughout the course of this. So, Sally, I think you were up first. Sally Gill, Greenwich, are you there? If you have the opportunity to unmute. Oh, try again. There we go, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, talking about a call to action, obviously with the Black Lives Matter thing, what do you think as lawyers we could be doing? Personally, I've joined a local initiative of other people, not all lawyers. In fact, I think I am the only lawyer, around trying to be a vehicle for change. And we're going to be doing some campaign work, setting up a not-for-profit, etc. But what do you think we could all be doing in terms of the Black Lives Matter agenda? It strikes me as we need to do something.
Thanks for that, Sally. Does anyone on the panel want to go first with that? I know, Jane, you'd mentioned that previously when we met. Or Rebecca, sorry.
If Jane wants, Jane's more than welcome to jump in first.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're so polite, aren't we? We're spreading the love, as my friend Judy would say. I think that it's really important, and we talk about it a lot at NCLS, and we talk about representation. Some of the things that we've been doing, and we've had some quite a lot of hate crime, COVID-related race hate crime was reported to us through some of our colleagues at City of Sanctuary. And so we've, the last couple of weeks, had a meeting last night. I've sort of started a conversation about developing a network. And obviously I'm interested in it from a few areas. We run a discrimination service, which I failed to mention at the start, and we want to do some proactive work to promote that discrimination service, to make sure that people are signposted into it. That service is provided by our friends in Suffolk Law Centre, who also have quite a strong track record of working in partnership, holding the local police service to account. So experience in complaints against police. So these are conversations that we've had. From NCLS perspective, it's really important that what our response is driven by what the community want us to do. We're very much a community law service. But yeah, Black Lives Matter is firmly on our agenda, and yeah, we very quickly responded, and we led the creation of this sort of informal network that we hope will grow. But we're not leading it, we're facilitating it, because it has to come, the requests and how we shape our services to respond has to come from the community. It's a really important point, Sally.
Yeah, and Jane, you've just illustrated perfectly the point I was about to make, which is, there is a huge amount that can potentially be done, and this is one where we really have to be very careful and ask the question about what should pro bono do, because actually organisations specialise and they know the issues. They should be being funded to be able to take on the issues that arise. This is not something that should be completely dependent on pro bono ever. So I think it's something where, for us as firms, we're having conversations to make sure that we understand what and where within our existing work we could be expanding that work and how we can be supporting. But we're really trying to get that balance of pro bono is there to make sure that people don't fall through gaps and to make sure that injustices don't go unchallenged. But actually, first of all, we should be talking to the organisations like Jane's who specialise and make sure that they have the funding and that they have the skills and specialism to do the work, so that we can then be thinking about how to support them. So I think, it's similar to some of the issues that arose with COVID, that if we jump in too quickly offering too much pro bono, then there is a risk that that sort of support isn't made available to the organisations, because the assumption could be, well, pro bono can solve that. You don't need funding to do this because people will do it for free. And I think this is such a fundamental issue in terms of rights that we should be pushing to say organisations need funding first.
Super, thank you. Hopefully that covers. I know it'll be a much bigger discussion about that, and possibly an opportunity to plug at this point our clinics forum, where there will be hopefully the opportunity to continue this discussion as well. But we did have another question from Laura B, and I know there's been a lot of comments in the chat box to try to help answer and share experiences. But Laura, if you did want to elaborate on that question any further, feel free to unmute and raise your point.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you very much to those of you who have put some answers in the chat box already. My question was with one eye on the future. So I run a legal advice clinic at a university in Leicester. And I am starting to think now about how training for the new student advisors is going to have to be different, because we're going to at least partly, I think, be preparing for virtual teaching in September. Has anybody yet tried out training completely new volunteers remotely, and do you have any tips or observations about that, please?
Can I just interject there, Laura? I think that's the next question. We're going to be going through training volunteers. So we jumped the gun a bit. So it may be appropriate to pick that up after the next session.
Okay.
I think, Tracey, actually, if you want to go now with that.
Go now, then it just leads on to that then, doesn't it?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, if you don't mind, Deborah, now we're getting into the swing of it. One of the things, again, one of our questions we were interested in is knowing, again, it's kind of a bit black and white. Can you supervise your volunteers remotely? We're just interested to know to what extent there are organisations at the moment who already feel they're able to do that, or whether others, like Laura, starting to think of it afresh, thinking, how do we begin to go about doing that? And in the meantime, Tracey, yes, fine, hand over to you on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of in what I was going to cover anyway, because I think I have to explain how I supervise now before I can say how it's changing. Last year with clinic, because of the nature of my clinic, I'm never on campus. I supervised entirely, apart from the client interviews, through Microsoft Teams anyway. I have a bespoke case management system that the students can access via the web. Last year, it was only accessible through desktop computers on university premises, so we had some control for GDPR purposes. I've had to relax that slightly because of COVID, and the students do sign an advisor contract saying that they won't share anything, they won't download anything on their own computers, etc. So there has to be an element of trust there. So the way I supervised in clinic last year was the students prepared the letter of advice on the case management system, told me when that had been completed. I would go in, amend the letter with track changes, and then send that back to them via Microsoft Teams. I also had meetings on Microsoft Teams with various students, and they would communicate entirely through Microsoft Teams if they had any queries in respect of that. So that hasn't changed. I mean, SULAC runs as a module, so all of my training is carried out at the beginning. It was face-to-face, obviously, initially. I don't have volunteers joining halfway through because that just would not be manageable. So really, going forward, I think all of the training is going to have to be done on Microsoft Teams. I mean, since lockdown has occurred, a lot of lecturers are doing online teaching via Teams rather than Blackboard at the moment. So the students are capable and fully understand the concepts of Microsoft Teams. So I think all my training, induction training and subject-specific training at the start of term is going to be done via Microsoft Teams online. As far as moving forward, next year we have taken a decision that we are running our clinic entirely virtual for the next academic year, because I don't see how I can go to all these places safely. I certainly don't want to be taking the students to any hospitals anytime soon. So the thing that is going to change next year is the client interview. I'm hoping if the client has got the technology that we will still be able to have the students interviewing the clients via Microsoft Teams in pairs with me on the call as well to take over in the event that something goes wrong, because the students in my clinic don't interview the clients on their own. They are supervised with that as well. In the event that the client doesn't have that technology, it may be on occasions that I have to take instructions from the client without the students and then just pass them on to the case notes that they can then do the letters in their usual way. So other than the interviews, the clinic is going to run exactly the same. It's going to be via Microsoft Teams, and I then send the letters out either by email or by post once the students have carried that out. But I certainly wouldn't be able to function without a web-based case management system. So the beauty of SULAC is that we had that all in place before this happened. So it's relatively easy to be paperless, to be GDPR compliant, and use Teams just to communicate with the students. I think from a student wellbeing point of view, I suppose this applies for lectures as well as clinic. I'm concerned about, we're obviously going to lose to a certain extent the team ethos because we're not face-to-face. So I probably am going to incorporate more Microsoft Teams meetings with the clinic students as a whole to make sure that they aren't isolated and don't feel sort of out on a limb because they're not going to be face-to-face. I mean, last year when because we had a minibus and we took them to all these different venues, and I found that the camaraderie between the team really built up in that environment. And I think, unfortunately, that probably is going to be lost through a virtual clinic. So we have to find some way to connect them via, I think Microsoft Teams is a great piece of kit to be able to build that spirit up. I prefer Teams to Zoom, and I think the feedback is that Teams is a safer platform for client interviews than Zoom. That's certainly the feedback I've got from people that in our IT department. It's a safer option. So we are in fact talking, moving more and more to using Teams for lectures as well rather than Blackboard. So that's how we're going to be supervising in the future.
Thanks for that, Tracey. It's entirely kind of outside my comfort zone. There's a question saying from Lucy Yateman saying, which case management system do you use? I
use Advice Pro just because having come out of private practice, the Advice Pro really sort of fits with what I was using in private practice. It has all the functions. You can carry out conflict searches. It's like a mini law firm's case management system. So I thought it's great training for the students so that when they go into private practice, they're familiar with the type of system that they might have to use. So I'm a really big fan of Advice Pro. I did look at the other systems, but the other systems tended to be, there was a lot more input that was required from me to build the system to fit our needs, whereas Advice Pro came with lots of options, and then you could just opt for that or hide that function. So I've been really impressed with Advice Pro.
Could I jump in there? Thank you, Tracey. That is helpful because it's a question that we've been asked an awful lot recently, and we have ran a couple of our online info exchanges about how to move online and all the intricacies that come with that, finding systems that will work, finding ways of joining up volunteers and clients, and everyone's got a different model. I don't think there is a right or a wrong way of doing that. It's just finding what fits for you, your organisation and your volunteers. We do have some resources on the LawWorks website about that, and we will be picking up the conversation again in preparation over the summer months to help student-led or law school clinics to prepare for the new academic year, both to run their services online but also to train volunteers. So we are looking into that. If anybody wants to engage with us, do reach out, pop us an email. I can excitedly share our next set of polls, which this one is quite, I think, helpful. There we go. So that's looking very positive, I think, hopefully. And will maybe give others reassurance and the opportunity to connect with others who have found a way to supervise volunteers remotely and chat that through. We had a request in the chat box from Sonia. If you're there, Sonia, do feel free to unmute yourself to come in.
Yes, thank you. It was just a comment really on this issue of training students remotely and doing so via video conferencing, whichever platform is used. I think it is really useful to be able to train them that way. But I think in addition, and from a safeguarding point of view, we are going to have to train our students to think carefully about the space that they are using for their video conferencing. So for the training, I think that should be part of it. But then when they are going to be potentially video interviewing clients, perhaps doing it from their bedrooms, they may have to, that might be the only space that they have. But we do need to educate them that from a safeguarding point of view, they need to have perhaps a professional looking corner that they can use for that. And if we can build that in from the beginning, really, that's only going to help them. So that was the only comment I wanted to make.
I think I'm probably going to get them to use the, I'm not sure of the wording, but the backdrop, which you can use in Teams, so you're not actually seeing the area, but it's a really good point.
Yeah, we've created a sort of it's a moving feast really, the document, but that's one of the issues that we've picked up. It's like a volunteering protocol, which is giving advice and tips to volunteers, but also to make sure that they sign up to it and that they think about it. And in that, we've given a contact number of the advice and volunteer manager, so that if there are issues or concerns, they've got that direct link back to somebody. So it's a really important issue.
Thank you.
I think the other thing to think about as well is making sure that they've not got mum and dad and all the mates in the same room at the same time, which hadn't really incorporated into my training, but now you've mentioned that, that's sort of occurred to me.
I can just see there that Jane's colleague Judy has a little blue hand raised. Judy, if you're there and want to come in, I can...
Yeah, I just, so as soon as lockdown started, we knew we wanted to bring students back. And we did a survey to check, and we still do that. So any student working at home has to give us an assurance about where they're working, if it's appropriate, if it's private. And we've actually had some students who can't engage at the moment because they don't have that space. And just to reaffirm Jane's point is that we then send them a very strict protocol about it, and then each service manager has to manage that and make sure that they're okay. Even when a member of staff is joined to a call, some of the issues they might be dealing with are quite sensitive, so confidentiality is key. And so that clients, you know, even if we do have students involved, that clients are confident that all the high standards are still being met from their point of view. And you're absolutely right, you know, mum and dad should not be coming in the room, or, you know, a sibling is coming to be annoying. So we're still doing that survey, and that's been really helpful to make the students think about how they're working. We also actually track when they're volunteering remotely. So if they are working, they may not necessarily be doing client work, but we're actually recording the sessions that they're doing, you know, whether it's Monday 2 till 4. So we have an idea of the hours they're giving to the organisation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Judy. I think that kind of leads on quite nicely into one of the questions I was going to ask Deborah to kind of lead with, is that point about volunteers, and obviously when they're in the office it was easier to try and kind of have that engagement with them. And so how will you keep volunteers motivated and engaged when working remotely? And will it differ to what you currently offer?
So I'm going to have to echo the comment that was made earlier with the lack of cake is a distinct issue, but yeah, as was said earlier, we've got to find the other ingredients now. But for us, it's really all about connectivity and keeping up connectivity, and that means, you know, making sure that so we use Zoom or Teams at Goldman Sachs, and it's about making sure that, you know, we're having, you know, when we're launching a project, that we're having kickoff calls, that we're introducing the right people via Zoom, that people then start to feel like a team on our side, to keep the volunteers engaged. We set up, in addition to having Zoom meetings, we set up, we have an internal chat, an IM system that we use. So we set up kind of subgroups within that, and just make sure that, you know, that people have another avenue to discuss. But, you know, it's just about, I think it's just about really increased connectivity, and also trying to, the problem I think with Zoom a lot is that you lose a bit of the informality, because everything then suddenly seems like it's a meeting, and that, you know, we all have to be very professional and discuss only meeting things. And you know, when you don't have that ability to just, you know, see your volunteers in the hallway and ask how things are going, you lose a bit. And so we try to also just have other types of activities where we can bring people together that way. So it, you know, social events to make our volunteers feel a bit more connected.
Yeah, can I just, I totally agree with you. I think one way to make Zoom feel less formal is to have people turn up with unicorn horns and flashing Minnie Mouse lights on their heads. So we do that. I think the other thing though is that our work is really engaging, and we have more students apply this year than ever before. And I think that again, that's our track record, I guess. So the work keeps our volunteers engaged, but we've recently, just this week, we're having a series of farewell Zoom meetings with the students that are leaving us, and we've invited the new students. And so they're very much part of the team. So that's been really successful. And our volunteers are all on the team WhatsApp groups as well. But I definitely recommend Unicorn Horns for Zoom meetings because they certainly break the ice.
I was disappointed to see that Judy didn't have a tiara on today.
I would just add to that, and actually all these comments about remote cake, it's perfectly possible. I am discovering so many tiny bakeries across the country who deliver cakes by post. I have tested them all; they're very nice.
And
so yes, so you know there's a definite support your local organisations that bake cakes and send baked goods through the post. There are all sorts of things out there. There's a farm that will bring a goat to your session. There's a mini donkey that will join your session. So sort of having these check-ins with volunteers and trying to have moments of lightheartedness in them, just keep people positive in the middle of conversations that might sometimes be quite stressful. That definitely helps. And I think the other thing for us has just been recognizing, normally in the office, you walk past people in the corridor or you bump into them while you're making a cup of tea and you just say, oh, thanks for that piece of work you did. And realizing that none of that is happening. And so we have to consciously be recognizing and acknowledging what people are doing. You know, it might feel to us like we spend half an hour or an hour a day sending emails to people saying, thanks so much for that work you did. Really appreciate that you're continuing to do this. And for us, it feels like we're just saying the same thing over and over. But for the volunteer at the other end who's possibly been sitting at home for weeks on end on their own doing this work, it's just nice to have somebody say, I know what you're doing and I really appreciate it. So that too.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. I think, so one of the other things I was kind of think leads on from that is that issue around well-being. So one of the things we're doing through the Litigant and Person Support Strategy for the past couple of years is doing some workshops around the country, particularly looking at how you try and support staff who are dealing with increasingly distressed clients. And one of the issues that came from that sessions is, well, to what extent should we be trying to help kind of volunteers with their well-being? So I promised it's the last one, but since we're on a poll roll, I'm not sure that's a word, but you know what I mean. It'd be great if we don't mind having the last poll question, which is about how important is it for organisations to support the well-being of their volunteers? Because I imagine there's some differences across the different organisations, and I certainly know of some organisations who, whilst their volunteers are taking place in a volunteering session, they also have a Zoom staff room open to try and enable volunteers to chat to each other because they've lost that, but also a chance for them to talk to a member of staff. Or some really well-established volunteering networks with certain organisations have set up WhatsApp groups. So there are all sorts of different things that people are doing there, but just interested to know from our panel, and maybe Rebecca, if you've got a bit more you can say on this, about how you support the well-being of them. If there's anything particular you think firms or similar your organisations train, or Tracey, particularly with students, that you're doing in that regard.
Sure. I think, you know, and also the first sort of reaction to this is as well, when we're talking about firms sending volunteers to not-for-profits, it's absolutely the responsibility of the firms, I think, to manage our volunteers' well-being. We should be adding more pressure to the not-for-profit organisation who are also trying to manage their clients' well-being and their own and their colleagues' well-being. So I think it's also different organisations on the call will have different levels of responsibility in terms of what they do. With us, I think when I first came into the firm, we organised some training relatively early on with specialists who came in and did training on how to work with people who might be traumatised or vulnerable, to understand and be able to support people in any sort of client interactions. And then a second session on self-care and how to recognise when you might be getting impacted and how to handle that. We've carried on trying to think about that, and obviously all the sessions that LawWorks and others in the Litigants in Person Network have done, they've all been really helpful too. I think some of the practical things are just, for certain areas of law, we're very clear to the volunteers at the start, look, this is an area of law that some of you may find more difficult to handle than others. And that, where necessary, having that direct conversation with volunteers of, do you understand and do you genuinely feel that this is something you can do without it impacting on you? So having the conversations at the start. I think for us, we're very fortunate that many of our firms have employee assistance schemes, and people forget about those, but our firm is literally paying for access to counselling for individual people. So if somebody is actually really impacted by a case, then we can be signposting people to services like that. But I think even just on a regular basis, the check-ins that we're all talking about motivating volunteers, they also provide a really good way to keep temperature checking the volunteer. You know, if I'm saying to the volunteer each week, how are you doing? How are you doing? I see, and I have seen over the course of the weeks, people are up here 1 week, they're down here. You can tell just from the conversations. And so that allows you to understand, okay, how much time do I need to be devoting right now to supporting this volunteer, or to moving them from this piece of work that they're clearly struggling with right now, and to thinking about bringing somebody else in to help on that. And also, just as part of that, you know, I think we're all being pressured right now to try and say everything is fine, we're on top of everything, we're just handling this, when the reality is it's really quite difficult. And so, you know, I sort of very often said to volunteers, I'll try and frame it more in terms of, well, I know when I did this piece of work before, I found that it had this impact on me, and I wondered if you're having that. And actually sort of giving them permission of, I know that this can have this effect on you, and it's okay for you to tell me that now. You know, this is not a call where you have to say, I'm fine, it's perfect, there's no problem. So I think just really trying to make sure that you give volunteers the opportunity to say that they might be having a bad week, or they might be struggling, and to be thinking about how you can then step in, bring more people in to support them, give them a break from that piece of work, whatever you have to do, so that they're not suddenly unable to do any work because of the pro bono or the other work that they've been given by you.
Okay, if I can just lead on from there, I touched on it earlier about the additional support which I'm hoping to bring into the clinics, given that we will be running remotely to make sure the students aren't isolated. But from a general point of view in clinic, invariably either myself or a colleague are sitting in with the students, so we can usually read the room as to whether anything is affecting them. From an emotional point of view, one of the strands of my clinic was for cancer patients in the local area via Macmillan Cancer Support. So I was very conscious that certainly some of the members of the clinic, students, had been touched by cancer personally in their families. So in addition to the processes which we have in place within the university of counsellors and student guidance and disability, if any of the students are suffering, Macmillan Cancer Support also offered to give some additional support that we believe that some of our students were being triggered by some of the clients' issues that they were seeing. But it is very much a question of reading the interviews at the time and knowing your students when you're going into these types of scenarios.
Can I just quickly come in? It's really important, but I wanted to talk about some of our solicitors, particularly those in small law firms, and the impact of COVID on them that have been furloughed. And we've got one, for example, who, you know, basically has had to furlough their support, and so they've been fantastically supportive on our free legal advice rota, but they've got particular issues as a result of COVID on them and their work pressures. And I think what through our work, I guess what we've done is make them, it's okay for them if they want to step away. We have put a call out because family and domestic abuse cases have gone through the roof. So we've been, you know, we really could do with a bit, we do need more pro bono, but we target and the lawyers that we know are really struggling have been furloughed, different interpretations of furlough. Can you volunteer during furlough? Concerns by their law firms about the legal implications. So you know, obviously we care about all of our volunteers, but the issues for some of our solicitors are significant, and some of them, you know, there's big questions about whether will their law firms survive COVID, some real challenges that has an impact on how they can and what can work with us and our clients.
Thank you very much, everybody. Let me just find it. I will end the poll so I can share the exciting results. Quite unsurprisingly, I think this is obviously a very important issue, and certainly one that LawWorks and I'm sure many other organisations will be picking up. But if we can all work together, then collaborating and meaning that we're not all starting from square one and scratch, and pooling all these ideas, I think, together is really, really helpful. Bex, back to you.
So I think we'll try and share from, so we've got a working group which is looking particularly at this issue of working with distressed clients. And what's been really interesting for us is we've had a psychiatrist who's been alongside us all, and what the difference that's made, rather than all of us struggling to try and work our way through it. If nothing else, it's been really useful having him say, you can't deal with all the issues that are being presented. I'm a psychiatrist of 30 odd years. I can't begin to tackle these issues, but therefore make it feel reasonable what may or may not be appropriate for you to kind of try and look at in regard to these issues. And what we're trying to explore next week is to what extent, when we do start to return to face-to-face services, which can look so different, how might that therefore impact on the behaviours which we're seeing from clients, and how do we try and best prepare ourselves for that? One of the things which came up when we were speaking earlier this week is around the volunteering, and particularly given that lawyers' workloads at the moment kind of very much kind of going up and down depending on what area of law they may be in and the like. We're trying to see what tips could be given on how to make volunteering for lawyers kind of as easy as possible, and how can they fit it around unpredictable workloads. And Deborah or Rebecca, I don't know if you want to lead with that.
I can kick off on that one. I think that that's a key one for us. I think the lawyers on our end at the moment are suffering from huge workloads, but very unpredictable workloads, just given the unpredictability of the markets. So we're seeing kind of periods where people don't have a lot to do and they want to give a lot to pro bono, and then other periods where, you know, the risk is that then they've then taken too much on, and you know, unfortunately it's a very small curve. So the very busy periods are followed the next week by a very quiet period, and you know, it's a real concern for us because we don't want to over promise and under deliver. So it takes a lot more management, I think, on our end to make sure that, you know, when people say they've got time, that we're not giving them a workload that's, you know, that is going to overwhelm them then the next week when they're flat out with work. So we're trying to make sure that, you know, people can have smaller discrete tasks that can be done in a shorter amount of time. For those that are overworked, we see if we can get them kind of more of an assistance type job where they can, you know, they can help out and help others, but not be front of line. Because I think, you know, as others have mentioned on the panel, it doesn't help when we give volunteers who then can't see things through, and that's a real concern. So something that just requires a lot more, I think, prep on the organizational front, but you know, something that we always have to have front of mind.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's one of the things we find with lawyers is there is no one type of lawyer. There are lawyers in our firm who just want to take on a regular scheduled slot on a regular basis because it's in their calendar, they can plan around that, and that is what they want to do. And then you have lawyers who sort of say, actually, I'm between deals and I've got a load of capacity for the next month or two, and then it's probably going to get busy again. And then you have lawyers who just say, you know, look, I'd just like to maintain ongoing work in this area. I can just pick it up and drop it as I need to, but I'll sort of be part of a team. So there's always a group of us who are progressing the matter, and then it might just be some weeks I'm quiet and somebody else is busier. So, you know, we do have a wide range across the firm. And so for us, a large part of it is about trying to make sure we know realistically what those different groups look like, which ones are the ones that are most looking for more pro bono work at the moment. And just be thinking about that when we are talking to organisations about pro bono opportunities. And so I think, you know, probably the biggest tip would be for the not-for-profit organisations, don't feel bad about being honest about the workload that you might need. You know, if you have cases that are quite intense and heavy, tell us, because some firms are going to say that's not a problem. We have lawyers who can definitely deal with that, and we can start to figure out the scheme through which we're going to take those cases on. And then other firms who are going to say, look, we know that we're not going to be able to do that. So I think just the more we know at the beginning of conversations about the realistic workloads, the more we can make sure that you're partnering with the right firms who can support you, and that we're putting our resources where we can be most helpful without suddenly being unable to support. You know, I think the other thing for us has been really emphasizing, and I know more and more firms are doing this now anyway, but really making sure that pro bono work is treated as equal to billable work in terms of how it's recorded, how it's recognised by the firm, how it's supervised and insured, because the more that you do that, the more it becomes part of every other piece of work the lawyer has to do that week, instead of, oh, you also now have to try and fit this in. So just really trying to make sure that within the firm's culture, pro bono is just something people do. We've got some of our departments have work allocation managers who can sort of keep an eye on who's busy, who's not, when new work comes in. And anybody on pro bono is able to say to them, I've got a pro bono matter, so I'm using this much time a week on this matter. And that's built into what are the work they're given. You know, the collaborative plan as well, I think one of the benefits for both the collaborative plan and the in-house working group and LawWorks is that when you work together, you're able to actually design projects that maybe they allow multiple firms to work together. So you're sharing the resource, and some lawyers might be able to take on the more complex, time intensive, and some the smaller pieces. But it also means you're drawing on lots of different perspectives from lots of different firms and in-house teams and organizations in designing it in the first place to make it work.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm aware we... Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add from a university perspective. I was conscious of the, particularly in Stoke, in that a lot of the firms are basically grassroots solicitors firms. So they're working under a lot of pressure trying to be profitable for their own means. So in clinic, I tend to use our local lawyers to come in to do the initial training on subject specific areas. And also then on a case-by-case basis, you know, they're there at the end of the phone if the students need some further assistance or if we need some help on a case-by-case basis, rather than having a formal arrangement whereby the local lawyers are supervising the students as well.
Thanks for that, Tracy. Which is, and we've spoken about this, like I said, because the panel had a bit of a chat earlier the week. What was quite interesting, we were talking about, well, what opportunities does this current situation provide for volunteers both now and also in the future? And do you envisage needing different skills and abilities from volunteers? And particularly, would there be a rise of non-traditional volunteer roles? So just interested to hear the views from the panel on that.
Who's next?
If I can just come back on that, just on uptake, one thing I did notice running the clinic virtually over the summer period is one of the problems I do have in the face-to-face clinics is running an appointment system and then getting no-shows. So I'm hoping that if we are running a virtual clinic, the students will actually have more uptake, because we won't have that position, because the clients will be at home, they won't have to travel, they may be able to commit to that time without having to get anywhere. But then the downside of that is the technology issue and whether or not the students are going to be able to interview the clients on that basis. But I'm hoping uptake will be higher if the clients aren't having to physically travel to the premises.
And I think that also ties in with the role of kind of the ability to expand geographically. I think London has an enormous pool of volunteers with, you know, you've got from law firms to in-house communities. And I think you tend to see historically that volunteering being done within London, and I think now we've got the opportunity to expand that outside of London with the increased use of technology, and just making sure that, you know, that we actually act on that and make sure that other communities who may be lacking in volunteers have the opportunity to tap into that London market via the technology that hopefully people are getting and will be comfortable with.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. I mean, we run services across free legal advice services, Cromer, Yarmouth, Kings Lynn, and we've been able, now we're appointment system only, so we've been able, it doesn't matter if you're from Norwich, you can be seen if you turn up at the offices and we can book you in. It doesn't matter where that solicitor is, so there are opportunities there. And definitely in a rural area, the issue of travelling in to volunteer in the office is helpful. The other thing, our family court, we've got a really tech-savvy family court volunteer who has done some amazing work on putting some of our paper forms online and creating surveys. So I think the definition of what does a family court volunteer actually do, you know, it does include technology. And then I also think some of our staff team have turned into trainers and have helped some of our volunteers who perhaps aren't so tech savvy with technology. So it's been, and so we have volunteers, for example, who may never have used a smartphone particularly, and now they are attending remote court hearings using smartphones. So it's also about building skills, where, you know, we're helping build skills, different skills of volunteers. So they're real opportunities, aren't they, I think.
And I'd say that's important also, and you know, for when you're looking at the charities, when you're reaching out to your partners who are providing volunteers, just to keep in mind that, you know, the law firms in London, the in-house, you know, at a place like Goldman, we've got a phenomenal tech team, and these tech teams also want to do skills-based volunteering. You know, it's not legal pro bono, it's tech pro bono. And they love to do things like that. And that's, you know, there are synergies within the organizations that are providing volunteers that can be tapped and should be tapped going forward.
Yeah, you know, I think, perfect. I was just going to talk about that, just this issue of now, you know, our volunteers are all learning these new skills of being flexible because nobody knows what's going to happen the next day. But they're also learning much more about how to use technology, and you know, I think we're all expecting that's likely to be an increase and more remote services. But that point that Deborah makes there about things like having skilled tech people available, you know, there is this side to, as much as we can use tech and remote services to support people, not everybody can use that anyway, so there's still always the inevitable face-to-face. But even for people who can use it, just thinking a little bit more about the accessibility side. So if you're creating a piece of advice in a video for clients, which you can share online, maybe drawing on some of that tech expertise to make sure that there's subtitles all the way through the video at the bottom, or that there is a voiceover. Just trying to think more and more, well, if we're using all of these different ways now to engage, and we want to try and make sure that as many people as possible can access these digital services, if we've got access to Deborah's tech team, bring them in and make this video support something that everybody in the community can access. Obviously, some of those people will still need that face-to-face, but even there, it allows us to start thinking about trying to make things more accessible, I think.
Thanks, Rebecca. I was going to ask you and Deborah on that. So when you've talked previously about how kind of responding to Grenfell or responding to kind of COVID-19, to what extent is when the kind of firms and the kind of in-house counsel try and see how they can best put their skills to whatever the need is there kind of the opportunity there as well to tap into the much wider support teams? On the whole, is that focused more around those immediate kind of legal issues?
I think it probably depends entirely on the support that's needed. You know, if for example, an organisation was saying right now, we need a huge amount of printed material to be printed and sent out, just like everybody else, we have very, very, very minimal presence in our offices. So certain things just couldn't necessarily be done from home. So I think, you know, it's sort of anything and everything is potentially possible. The main thing that doesn't necessarily happen is people ask the question in the first place. So the more conversations we have, the more we can say, well, actually, yes, you know, we have somebody with tech skills who's able to do this, or we have people in the secretarial and the administrative teams who would love to be involved and to help support remotely. And we've just never been able to do that before. So now we can actually talk to them about how they could support you. So I think there is a huge range of potential support there. And this is the time to have those conversations about how we could try and make use of that.
Yeah, I mean, I just say, you know, on our end, and, you know, Goldman is not alone in this. This isn't a Goldman thing, but on our end, our engineers are hugely involved in giving skills-based volunteering. They are very, very active in this field. You know, working with charities throughout London, worldwide, and I think that, you know, we need to work together in this front. And, you know, internally, I talk a lot with the head of our tech volunteering committee, and we make sure that we're coordinated. So I know who they're reaching out to, and they know who I'm reaching out to and who's reaching out to me. And that we just don't, I tend not to get the questions, but if the questions were ever to come, I would put people in touch with the right people internally. You know, and it should be a holistic approach to things, and we shouldn't have to think of tech as well, it's not pro bono, so Deborah at Goldman doesn't deal with it. You know, I think we all need to just keep the conversation open a lot more.
I think I'd just like to add as well, I think a lot of the sort of non-university legal advice clinics could reach out to the local universities, because I'm a big believer in that the other schools of the university could sort of help out in a almost a quasi street law kind of concept. So I do think the universities have the knowledge and expertise that they could help the other advice agencies.
Thanks everyone. I think we've now just got a couple of minutes to go, and then the kind of final session starting. So I really just wanted to take the opportunity. I mean, I'm told I meant to do kind of neat to wrap up, but I think we've covered so much here that it's hard to kind of pin it down to kind of one key point. But I think really useful resources being shared in the group chat. So thank you very much everyone for doing that. I know in such a big kind of Zoom call, it's hard to feel part of it, but the fact people have been sharing those resources is much appreciated. And particularly, I slightly feel I've done the kind of Graham Norton Eurovision, loving the polls. So thank you for indulging me in it. And thank you to Deborah, Jane, Rebecca and Tracy. Really appreciate all your input. And now handing over to Claire, because I think surely they're about to start the final bit of the session. Thanks, everyone.